Hey class, today I wanted to cover relativism for you guys, the ethical position of relativism, and really just kind of highlight its failures as a system. It has some great motivations, it really wants to do nice things, but it really can't hold up under the weight of its own theory. And so I'm going to explain it today, the objections to it, through two different authors, through Herodotus, an ancient historian, and through Ruth Benedict, who was a anthropologist in the early 20th century. So let's just jump right into this. So, way back in the day, we have Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which is in Anatolia. He's the first person to write a history, to really look into historical sources and ask people, eyewitnesses that were at certain events, to explain what they saw and to cite those sources. So he's really seen as kind of the father of history. He was for part of his life under the rule of the Persian Empire, and he was summoned to the court of King Darius of Persia. And of course, the Persian Empire went all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indian subcontinent. Well, there were some Indians there, Galatians they were called. And of course, there were plenty of Greeks all over the empire. Well, those Greeks and Indians were both at the court of King Darius. And so through an interpreter, we have these Greeks telling about their funerary customs and the Galatians telling about their funerary customs. So they have the Greeks. Perhaps you've seen Troy with Brad Pitt. You see there at the end that Achilles dies. They put the coins on his eyes, they put him on the funeral pyre, and they cremate him. And that is the burial custom for the Greeks. Well, for the Galatians, they had a very strange custom, or at least strange to us. They would put their dead relative into a big pot with water and perhaps some other things, and they would boil them. And then they would take some of the juice from that. So we're eating grandma's soup here, and they would drink some of that. They believed they were drinking in the spirits of their ancestors. So King Darius asks the Greeks, he's like, so you're gonna eat grandma? And they're like, tearing their clothes, like, no, don't ever say something like that. That's horrible. Why would you even suggest that? And and then he asks the Galatians, he's like, so how about just burning your dead relatives? And they're over there saying, may it never be, never do something like that. That will be horrible. And so Darius, or as at least Herodotus reports, says that custom is king over all, that the Greeks think that there's one way of doing things, and that the Galatians believe there's another way of doing things, and they think each other are wrong about that thing. So they think the Greeks are immoral barbarians, and the Greeks think the Galatians are immoral barbarians. So you've got custom, and then you've got morality here. And so, should we just conclude that custom is king overall, and the way that we do things is just down to custom? That there is no objective morality? That is what many commentators have thought that Herodotus meant. And then he's going to get some backup about 2,400 years later in the likes of Ruth Benedict, and she's going to say something very, very similar. And there's plenty of motivations for believing this. We have this big push for diversity, and diversity is useful and warranted and celebrated. And each culture does have its own customs, its own mores, and within that, we could generally say that they're right for the way they do things. It's not harming anybody or whatever. And so the relativist is going to say, well, each culture is right within its own framework, and and that we should tolerate them, and tolerating other cultures is virtuous and praiseworthy. And that right there is the first problem with relativism, because then you're coming up with a principle that is transcendent of any culture, is toleration of other cultures is virtuous and praiseworthy. Okay, well, why should all cultures be beholden to this if morality is just derived from the culture itself and not from anything that transcends culture? So cultural relativism already is on the ropes with at least that claim that we should be tolerant of other cultures because relativism is true. So this form a bit of a contradiction here. So should differences be celebrated? Well, you may say that'd be a nice thing, but if there's a culture that says, nah, differences shouldn't be celebrated, well, that's up to their cultural prerogative, so they don't have to go for it. So there you go. That's that's a problem for the relativist. So this really gets pronounced with Ruth Benedict. She is the one who went to the South Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean way back in the day, in about 100 years ago, and she wrote a book called Patterns of Culture. And she talks about these different cultures in these different islands, that if someone died in their family suddenly, someone dies from a heart attack or a snake bite or something like that, then in their grief, a person could go out and just kill someone else, and usually someone from a rival tribe, to assuage their grief. And so and then of course, when that person's body is found, then they can do a reprisal killing, whatever. Didn't seem like it would be a nice place to live. But that was seen as right for that culture. Everyone accepted that as the way that it should be. They were also very paranoid of being poisoned. They would lie to people all the time because maybe not family members, but visitors and others, because there was this paranoia of being poisoned, of having spells being put on you, and things like that. And so Ruth Benedict is just saying that that these are just cultural manifestations, and they're perfectly correct and right within their own culture. And no, that wouldn't fly here in the United States, but as far as the South Pacific Islands, then yeah, sure, that's great. So what she says is that our culture is but one entry in a long series of possible adjustments. And there's some truth to that. And I think this is why relativism has become such a popular position, is because there is truth to that. We are different from, say, 150 years ago, the way that even Americans acted, not to mention medieval Europe with the feudal system, or ancient Rome, which had a very, very different belief system. Think of Julius Caesar, who killed hundreds of thousands of Gauls and was celebrated for it. And today we'd say, hey, that guy's a war criminal. He committed genocide. But there he was celebrated for it. So there has been a lot of different adjustments in our ways that we organize ourselves and the mores that we have. So if we see that that cultures change and that the morality with those cultures change, then maybe relativism is true. That's kind of the argument for relativism. But a question we need to ask is, can we separate the descriptive from the prescriptive? Prescriptive is something prescribing, like the way things ought to be. Descriptive is just saying this is the way things are. So we can say, yeah, Julius Caesar did kill hundreds of thousands of Gauls. Now, we could ask a prescriptive question: should he have killed hundreds of thousands of Gauls? And to which probably we're going to say, no, that seems he was killing men, women, and children, non-combatants. It was genocide, and that seems to be wrong, killing innocent people. But if relativism is true, then he was right to do what he did in his Roman morality. So seems like we've got a problem. And here's the silly scenario: the tale of two countries. We've got the kingdom of Invaderland, or we can just keep going with Caesar here. They're aggressive, they're warlike, they have national pride that is predicated on their ability to invade and attack others. And you've got the People's Republic of Milksops, who are a bunch of wimps, I guess, and they don't like violence, they don't like war, they don't like anything. Well, they're right in their own context. Okay, and then you've got the Kingdom of Invaderland, who they're right within their own context, right? So what happens when the Kingdom of Invaderland finally expands to the Republic of the Milksops? Well, that's that's a problem for the relativist, whose morality now with these mixed cultures should they follow? As soon as they pass the border, should the Kingdom of Invaderland change to be pacifists, or should the milksops start to fight people? So when you have two conflicting moralities and two cultures that are contacting each other, who gets the upper hand? Is there something that either one could appeal to other than their own culture to say, yes, this is the right thing to do and we should do this instead? But with relativism, they just say, no, every culture is right within its own context. Well, that does not solve any problems at all. So it's quite problematic. Another problem with relativism, we could say, or we could no longer say, that any society's customs are inferior to our own. So, take the Star Wars example. The Empire and the Rebels are just two different civilizations, and neither one is right, neither one's wrong, except in their own context. Okay, so the Empire did nothing wrong. Darth Vader did nothing wrong, right? Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, you name it, terrible government somewhere in the past or present. The Chinese right now committing genocide against the Uyghurs there in Western China. Well, we can say, well, that's Chinese culture, and whatever. So we can't say, hey, you know what? Our culture is better than yours. Our culture is at least doing something right because we're not out here committing genocide and you are. So if relativism is true and each culture is right within its own context, then we have given up that right to say that other cultures are wrong in some way. Like today, we can say that America did not live up to its ideals before the Civil War. And its treatment of African Americans. We treated them as less than human. We treated them as slaves. And so we were not living up to our ideals of every man being created equal. So we can say that there is moral progress. We can't say, but if relativism is true, then can we really say that antebellum America was morally equivalent to America now? That seems kind of problematic to me. I want to reserve the right to say, hey, we've grown morally as a country or as a civilization. So another problem with relativism is that our actions are just decided by whatever the mores are of that civilization. So we can say, okay, should I do this? Should I not do this? Well, the only thing you have to do is see if it's an accepted action within your society. And if it is, then go for it. You're fine. Yeah. So should I hold slaves? Well, today that wouldn't be bad, but 200 years ago, that would have been okay, right? And that just doesn't seem to be true. That would be the case, that we should have our moral decisions made in those kinds of ways. So there should be something more than just consulting the standards of our society. And of course, our society changes over time. So what is true today as far as our mores wasn't true 20 years ago in some cases. So and what is a society anyway? We've got our subcultures too. And so are you part of, the South? You're part of North Carolinian culture. Maybe you're part of this religious group and this denomination within this religious group. You've got all these different subcultures. So where's the cutoff point with that? It seems like it would collapse. Cultural relativism would collapse into individual relativism from there, which is still pretty problematic. Here's one of the worst criticisms, or most damning criticisms of relativism, and this is the reformer's dilemma. The reformer's dilemma. So this is basically saying that progress is doubtful. So we're just as moral, because morality is basically a vacuous term, as we were 100 years ago, 50 years ago, last week, whatever. And so this man on the screen, you probably know who that is, Martin Luther King Jr. And he was a reformer, right? He fought against the cultural mores of the day, which in the South, people were at least implicitly okay with segregation, with African Americans being second-class citizens, because they didn't lift a finger to change any of it. So he starts fighting against that. He starts having marches, protests, speeches, organizing people to change this. But when he started, he was in the minority. So if he was to follow relativism, all he would have to do to see if his actions were right was to see if they would be approved of the larger community, the larger civilization. And well, he was working against the mores of his civilization. Segregation was the norm, and he was working against that. So under cultural relativism, that means that Martin Luther King Jr. was the villain. Yeah, let me say that again. He was the bad guy because he was breaking his civilizational mores. Now, I don't think that's a claim that any of us want to make, because I think we all now recognize that America was not living up to its ideals, that we were not treating people equally for some arbitrary and stupid reason. So we've got quite a problem here for cultural relativism. So that means that people like Jesus, who went against their cultural mores, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Muhammad, you name it, any reformer who has gone against the cultural mores of whatever civilization they live in, they're all the bad guys because they're bucking up against the system. So that seems to be a huge problem for relativism, and I think that is the one that really just defeats it in the first place. So if someone ever comes to me and says, "Yeah, cultural relativism is true," that's the first place I'm going. Is this reformer's dilemma? Like, how can you say, "Oh, so you think MLK was the bad guy, right?" Like, no. Like, well, then you've got a big problem on your hands. So that is a huge problem with relativism. But there's less disagreement than there seems to be with morality. There are some things that do transcend cultures. There are things that are endemic to the human condition. And I think this is one reason that we can have a better alternative than relativism. So we've got the let's eat grandma, right? With the collations back there. There's a lot of difference, or not a lot of difference. Think about the Hindu beliefs and cows. So they don't eat cows because they believe that there's reincarnation and that cows are persons. So you're not going to kill a person and eat them here in American culture, and you're not going to kill and eat a person in Hindu culture either. It's just their definition of person is much wider, much larger than it is here in the West. The infanticide and putting putting the elders out on the ice floes in the spring in Eskimo culture where springtime's coming. They're going to go hunt the caribou herds and be traveling hundreds and hundreds of miles. And you've got this old person who has no teeth. They have gout. They can barely walk. They're going to slow down the tribe, take up resources, and probably die along the way. Anyway, they made their culture where they would put their elderly out on the ice floes when they could no longer take care of themselves. Now, that does seem cruel, and you could make that judgment and say, well, that's cruel, that's terrible. But I think what they were doing, and I could still reserve the right to say they're wrong about doing it, but what they're doing is they're protecting the tribe and they're protecting the young. So their goal here, and this is where intention comes in and how much intention matters, is you could say that, well, their goal is not to kill people. Their goal is to protect the young and to protect the tribe. So so that's what we kind of see with that right there. So there's some kind of underlying principle behind that besides just let's go kill people. So I think that's one of these things that we can say is common to all cultures is protection of the young, protection of the group or the tribe. There's a few others like prohibitions against murder, and not killing, but murder. Usually a propensity towards telling the truth, protection of children, a few other things. So a lot of things that cultures have in common. We've got protection of children, presumption of truthfulness. I already said that. Oops. And even the Greeks and the Indians that we talked about, they have something similar with each other, is respect for the dead. So what they're doing is they are respecting their dead in the best ways that they know how. So even though that manifests in two very different ways, cremation on one hand and soup on the other, what they're doing is they are showing respect for their ancestors in the best way that they know how. So there is a lot more agreement there than there is disagreement. So relativism is a failure because it can't tell you that we need to be tolerant because that's a transcendent claim that transcends all cultures. It can't tell you that diversity is good because, again, that would be some kind of transcendent claim. It can't tell you that there's moral progress because there wouldn't be moral progress. It would be like Ruth Benedict said, and just another iteration in a long stream of variations. And it can't tell you that, or it would tell you that people like Jesus or MLK or Muhammad or whoever would be the bad guys because they're going against their cultural mores. So those just seemed like insurmountable objections. But I think what relativism is trying to do is trying to promote those things by saying we should be more accepting of other cultures and that we can understand that some of our customs are just these man-made things that do change over time. And I think those are true, and I think we can learn from those things. So what can we learn? Can help us see that things manifest differently. Perhaps help us to dispel our own prejudices. And it can help us to be open-minded towards other cultural practices. If you guys have ever been to another country or know people who are from other countries or something, you might see some different cultural attitudes and things like that, and see that maybe the way we do things here in North Carolina are different compared to the rest of the world. So we can recognize these things, but I don't think that means that relativism is true. There's just too many problems with it. Now, you can believe all sorts of things other than this, but this one just has too many contradictions. And throughout this semester, we're going to go over a lot of different iterations of morality and ethical theories on how each one works. And hopefully you can find a good alternative to relativism in there that you think answers the most questions and has the least amount of problems?